want to talk about the history of political assassinations from the vantage point of the global elite, and not just the political assassinations, but the bigger picture and what the overall plan is, again, from the vantage point of the books that they write. Of course, one of the key texts that you've heard me talk about, that I heard Alex talk about many years ago, is Bill Clinton's mentor at Georgetown, and that's Tragedy and Hope. Some years back, I did. Oh, actually, it's almost a decade on now. So it's a 10-year anniversary almost of reading through Tragedy and Hope and lecturing through the entire thing in about 16 hours worth of talks. You can find that on my YouTube channel. There's a whole playlist on the front of the channel, but um, it's good to go back and review this and tie it into other texts as well. We're going to talk about the Kalergi plan. We're going to talk about the banking system that was set up according to Quigley, and how this actually does tie into high-profile political assassinations. And this, of course, is probably the most important high-profile assassination since the late 60s with RFK, and then, of course, JFK and others as well. And then there's, appendix books that I think fill in the gaps since Tragedy and Hope and Anglo-American Establishment, like Johan Ratiu's book, which does get into the power structure and the faction of Israel, Zionism, all of that kind of is left off because Quigley was writing in the midst of the Cold War. This book was printed in the 1960s, but it's a very valuable insight. And every time I talk about this book, I have to always explain, because people just are dumb and they don't read books anymore, that I am not saying that it's true because Quigley says it. I am not saying that he's a good man. He is an apologist for the establishment perspective, and that's why the books are so valuable. Much like when we lecture through David Rockefeller's writings, or when we lecture through H.G. Wells's books, or Bertrand Russell's books, or any of the elite, Jacques Attali, they all lay out what their plans are, and they don't really have much shame in saying openly what the plan is. So let's go back to the beginning because, well, actually, let's start in the middle because there's an overlooked chapter that Quigley talks about describing the banking system and structure that was set up after Bretton Woods, after World War I and World War II, that this same power structure set up, it is a fiat debt-based system. And it has a name. It's called the Paribas system of the Rothschild banking family. In fact, this was the network of banking that was set up, according to Quigley on page 525, throughout Europe, particularly France and the Bank of England. That becomes the model for the U.S. Federal Reserve Bank. And the chief economist behind all of this is a guy you might have heard of named John Maynard Keynes, Keynesian economic theory, which is Fabian socialist economic theory. In fact, you may not have heard of this, but if you look at the party that Keir Starmer is a member of, he's a Fabian socialist. I just did an interview with a guy in the UK. It's going to come out, I think, today on X and in some other platforms, of a activist, kind of in the vein of Tommy Robinson, maybe a little more on the right, as we discuss the history of the Fabian Society, its members, its backers, people like Lord Rothschild and others, which are mentioned in these texts as essentially funding this soft socialism or this soft communism. So it's communism allied with big capital, and that's the key thing to understand, the Paribas system. And he says the whole system of the 20th century was headed by Baron Edward de Rothschild. The active head, however, was Rene Meyer, manager of the Rothschild Bank. And he goes on to talk about this network, this system, had control of news agencies. Havas was a monopolistic news agency in France. He goes on to talk about all the other structures and networks that they had set up, and that ultimately this dealt with this Federal Reserve fiat type system. So let's go back then to the beginning of the text, and he talks about how the history of Western civilization, particularly after the classical liberal reformation of the Enlightenment, ended up with a gold standard. And the problem with the gold standard is not that gold is itself bad or anything like that. It ended up being the best standard for those times, for that period. Eventually, however, the printing of and the making of gold notes was centralized. And it was centralized not in state power, but ultimately in private power. So, although gold was the best possible standard for having a flourishing society for many centuries, and we just recently on my channel lectured through Saifuddin Amis's famous book, The Bitcoin Standard. Most of that book is a critique of Keynesian economics and uh, actually talking about the gold standard. Eventually, however, the gold standard becomes centralized, and it's centralized in an international ledger system that's modeled around the Paribas system and the Bank for International Settlements system. But Quigley begins the book talking about that, and that this is how the world is run and controlled by this network. And he even says, he even goes so far as to say that if you look at Britain, when Disraeli, for example, captured the Suez Canal, he did that at the behest and at the actions of the Rothschilds. He says on page 133, Disraeli purchased with Rothschild money the Suez Canal for 3,680,000 pounds. So are you starting to realize that really the British Empire, I mean, there's definitely factions. It's not all one sided, but as this family gains control and as they work together with their other relatives in the European banking structure, Carol Quigley notes that they really do take power. They really do control these countries. And it's not just them. Obviously, eventually there's an alliance between the American industrialist families like the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, the Morgans. They're all allied together. But you might not know, or you might not recall, or you might not have read that early on, Quigley says that the danger that they saw at this time was two competing powers, the Austro-Hungarian Catholic power and Russia as the Orthodox power. And these two powers needed to be destroyed. And the way to do that was through World War. He doesn't outright say that the Lusitania was a false flag on page 251, but he hints at it because he says that there was a mysterious second explosion that sunk the ship. And of course, this begins U.S. involvement. And we also have the assassination, the high profile assassination of Gavrilo Princip of the Sorbian Black Hand, which was a nationalist secret society intent upon assassinating Archduke Franz Ferdinand. And I'm not saying that he was a hero. I'm very much pro-Serb. A lot of my audience are awesome based Serbs, but there can be political machinations and false flag events and these kinds of things that set off and stoke political violence or political sea change. And usually a high profile assassination is intended to do that. It might not always work in the favor of those trying to set it off. And again, I don't exactly know what the real story is. We always know that when there's a big high profile assassination, of course, everyone will question it nowadays, which is a good thing because they used to not question these things. They just accepted the CIA's creation of conspiracy theory out of the JFK assassination as a dogma that you must accept. If you dare to question it, you're a bad person. And we know that through the JFK documents that did come out, much of them were censored and blacked out, of course. But we did see some inklings that through James Jesus Angleton, he was definitely providing a lot of this information and info to Israel. So there is an Israeli involvement without question, especially through the Israelophile James Jesus Angleton. Angleton explicitly has said in the documents to be passing secrets to Israel. There's the Dimona program, which was a big part of this. Perhaps JFK seemed to be opposed to that. And so there's a motive there, at least in terms of opposition on the part of Israel to the Kennedys. We don't know if exactly that's why it went down. There were other players involved as well. There's the mafia. There's also the Jewish mafia. There's also Cuban exiles. Many of these networks and figures seem to play a key role at some degree in what happened with JFK. But to go back to the issue of World War I and the banking elites and Gavrilo Princip and the Black Hand and these secret societies and whatnot, again, this is par for the course. I'm not saying that I think Charlie Kirk was a righteous man who died for a wicked cause, or excuse me, for at the hand of wicked people. So I'm not demoting or denigrating the power and the value of it, but I'm noting that in history this happens pretty frequently. And it's somebody was saying, "Oh, this is America is a history of violence. Every nation has a history of violence when it comes to political elites, political assassinations. There was just a assassination of the Japanese politician Shinzo Abe not too long ago. There was Benazir Bhutto being assassinated some years back. So political assassinations happen everywhere, all over the world. If you read history, and if you read geopolitical history, this is normal in the big picture. Again, I'm not saying it's good. It's terrible. It's a tragedy. But this happens, and the reason I say that is usually when this happens, it is for some bigger power players' uh, purpose. We don't know exactly who was involved. I'm aware of all the data about Charlie Kirk reportedly refusing millions of dollars from Israeli donors and whatnot. I'm familiar with all of this. We don't know exactly if that's any proof that that's who was involved. It could be. Again, we're looking at possible motives. Is there a possible other shooter? It's possible. But the other thing, if you go back to 9/11, a lot of times people get lost in the detail. I'm not saying people can't investigate the detail, but people get lost in the details and they forget the big picture and who actually had motives. They forget the PNAC documents. They forget Brzezinski's Grand Chessboard, which talked about these types of things ahead of time. And those are I think, the big things to keep in mind rather than getting sort of lost in analyzing, every little detail, every little AI clip that pops up on Twitter. And, with AI, it's going to get harder and harder to analyze these events with manipulation of the imagery. So, what I can say is that zooming out, we know that there is a power structure in the West. There is an Israeli faction to it. There is a growing technocratic leftist insane faction. So there's these different factions, and they're all working towards a similar type of agenda of a one world government with some type of centralized religious and state power that can then dictate life and death. So whether you're a rabbinical minded person who believes that the Talmud teaches that everyone else is, cattle and that you should, subjugate them, or whether you're George Bernard Shaw and you believe that the technocratic elite are superior and everybody must come to you as George Bernard Shaw, the socialist, to decide whether or not they get to live or not. That's actual quote. He says, "In the technocracy, you will come to us to convince us why we should let you live and whether you are advantageous to the state." If you read 1984, that's who George Orwell is picturing. That's who he's talking about. Is people like Shaw, and Ingsoc is English Fabian socialism. Isn't it interesting that with Keir Starmer, with the socialist collapse of the UK that we're seeing, this is actually what Orwell was talking about. He was talking about the very thing happening right now. We're talking about the history of high-profile assassinations in the last century, and that the unfortunate event with Charlie Kirk is probably the most high-profile one since the late 60s. And what place do these events play in the bigger picture? I think the intention, again, judging by what we do know in regard to this being the shooter and all of that, as far as we know so far, that seems to back up the idea that the left believes perhaps that this would be a catalyst for kicking off or triggering more radical social violence from their perspective, from their side. And Alex is absolutely right. When you get out in the wild, when you go to political conventions, when you see people out there protesting, whatever, you really will encounter these sort of demonically possessed leftists. They do exist. They're out there, and they're unhinged. And there's all these groups that we've discussed when we interviewed BX, even here on the fourth hour, the 764, the comm groups, the satanic online groups, these networks. These are also real. You even had Kash Patel mention these, I think, in one of his discussions before Congress. So, the FBI is even aware of these things. And again, who exactly is running all these things and provoking these things is unclear. But that's definitely a pool from which one could easily draw unstable types of patsies, if that is the case. Think back to the World War II events, and we have the famous Reichstag event, where the Reichstag is burned down, and it's blamed on the slow boy, the individual that was supposed to be a communist. I'm not pro-communist at all. Again, this this whole lecture is against socialism. So, but again, it's a very common tactic in politics, not just a false flag, but high profile assassinations are common. I mean, even in the case of, Hitler, there was Operation Valkyrie, right, with the Count, what was his name, Stauffenberg. So this happens all the time, again, in politics, high profile geopolitical stuff, and it's not difficult to find idealized or indoctrinated, overly ideological individuals who are willing to do these kinds of actions that they think, because they're usually not very smart, they think is going to trigger some kind of world-changing event. So that usually it's a person with a kind of delusion that believes that their action will magically change the world or will trigger some, sea change, some big revolution. But as I said, I think that in this case, it's actually working more so on the part of waking people up to the reality of how vicious and radicalized the left has become. And that was not a wise move. If that was the intention, was to trigger copycats on the part of the left, that's not going to work. This has definitely made people, I think, awake even more so to how radical the left actually is. And people on our side of things, Alex and others, we've actually been saying, I mean, what people are waking up to, we should have woken up to this 10, 15 years ago. You're talking about people who were willing to not just get you fired or canceled or whatever, but I mean, they were hitting people with bike locks at Gavin McInnes's MAGA stuff 10 years ago. I mean, they were violent 10 years ago. So they're not going to stop being violent. You're not going to reason with demonic possessed people. Like, they've already surrendered the use of their reason. That's why we talked about last time those who are sons of Belial, right? They're wicked, worthless persons, as the Old Testament says. Now they can still be saved, but the more wicked you get, the more vile you get, the less likely you are to repent. And usually it takes some kind of serious type of event for a person that advanced in wickedness to actually repent. Again, we don't know the ways of grace and so forth, but that's why the death penalty was always there in Western civilization. Was there was a recognition of the reality of not just evil, but excessively evil and vile people. They're a danger to themselves and to society, and that's why there was a much broader use of the death penalty. Again, it's in Romans 13. I'm not saying we worship the state. I'm just saying that the death penalty is very clearly elucidated there. And most people don't know that the church fathers and throughout the history of Christian civilization, most Christian countries, nations, kings had the death penalty, especially for vile and heinous actions. And it's not just a deterrent, it's also an inducement that those people will repent. That's the last medicine that that kind of a person could have to induce repentance, is something that severe. And that's why, again, even if you haven't read the book of Genesis, I mean, Jesus is the one speaking to Noah, right? Jesus is the God of the Old Testament. Jesus is the one that gave the death penalty to Noah. Maybe you've forgotten Genesis, but if you believe the book of Genesis, then that's the revelation that we have. So it's not antithetical to what Jesus teaches. Jesus is the one that taught Paul in Romans 13 that the state has the right of the sword. First Timothy 1, Paul talks about the state has this authority to deter evildoers. So it's not a Orthodox Christian or a historic Christian position to think in these radical sort of Anabaptist types of views. That's what we talked about last time. But to get back to the 20th century, when we look at the survey of the geopolitical landscape and the type of world that the elites want to bring in, that's mentioned multiple times in the text, is not this is not a competing story or narrative to what the Zionist vision of the world is. In other words, if we look at what Moses Hess talks about as one of the key founders of modern political Zionism, he talks about the fact that he has this idea that he and others that the Freemasonic lodges will be the means by which the world's religions will be brought into a single cult. And this single cult will eventually work at the behest of fostering a single religious center in Jerusalem. So it's almost like the world religions will continue sort of being pseudo religions or covers or fronts, but they'll really be working at the behest of some supra religion controlling things in Jerusalem. He then goes on to talk about the fact that in his day, this is in the 1860s, he says he's already met with the Rothschilds who intend to eventually purchase the Holy Land and return it to Jewish ownership and Jewish power to bring about the advent of the Mashiach, the Messiah, that is for the Jews. So this isn't me. This isn't a anti-Semitic conspiracy theorist. This is a very famous book written by Moses Hess. It's called The Revival of Israel, Rome and Jerusalem. And it was written not after 1917, the Balfour Declaration, not after 1948. It was written in 1862. Okay. So it's time to stop being ignorant and stupid and unaware of the actual history and what people themselves write about. In fact, he says that the world religion that's coming is a world religion of socialism. He says it's dialectics and the movement of eternal matter. And he says, in his mind, that Jews will save the world through worshiping the Jewish race and the Jewish dialectical materialist religion. Now, I'm not saying that's the case. He says that the God of this religion is a relativistic, subjectivistic, pantheistic deity. And he says, if you want to understand my theology, it's Hegel and Spinoza. I'm not saying that every Jew believes that or that every Jew is a atheist, Zionistic, Spinozaist Jew. I understand that there's other positions. I'm aware of all that. I'm just pointing out that one of the most important founders of political Zionism himself says that in his book. Now, is that antithetical to what I read in the Fabian socialists like George Bernard Shaw or Sidney Webb or David Rockefeller himself, a almost Fabian socialist? No, it's the same type of ideology. There might be a little bit of a twist over here that, oh no, it's going to be Spinoza, Hegel, Karl Marx dialectical socialist materialism that is the world religion that we all worship. No, it's going to be the superstate itself, right? So in other words, if you read Brave New World, it's not antithetical to what you just read there. It's essentially the same overall plan. And, I've said this forever. So I don't know why people get hung up on, oh, you won't talk about this, you won't talk about that. I mean, we're literally talking about the BIS system right here. Like Quigley has entire chapters talking about the Bank for International Settlement system is the global Federal Reserve. And that's pages 324 and 325 in his magisterial tragedy note. Now, maybe you say, I don't have time to read these giant, boring books. I don't blame you. That's why I did your homework for you. I actually went and read this extremely boring text. It's not even as boring as other texts. I mean, it's actually readable in the sense like there's a lot of fascinating history in it. So if you're a history buff, you could make your way through it. But I mean, it's 1,300 pages, and no one else has done this. Okay, now shout out to Richard Grove. I mean, he talks about the book a lot, so he's probably the closest to what we do in terms of this type of approach. But there's literally no one else out there that has lectured through this text in all 1,300 pages. I did it for you 10 years ago. Almost nobody out there has actually listened to those lectures, at least as far as I can tell. I know Alex was way earlier than me in terms of being familiar with this stuff, but this book literally tells you everything. I mean, the entire 20th century from the vantage point of the global elite. It tells you all of it. And when you see it from their perspective, you begin to say, oh, now I understand why there is a Paribas Rothschild system that is the banking system of the whole world. That's the BIS, Federal Reserve for the whole world. Oh, I understand why the New Deal was a socialist Fabian attack on America that wasn't FDR being a good guy saving her, but it was actually a banker scam. The New Deal is a banker scam, pages 534 and 535. Now, again, Quigley is not a good man. He's a defender of this. He says this is the best hope that we have to end world wars is global democratic monopoly capitalism is essentially what he says. But I want to take issue, again, I know Alex is a big proponent of being a classical liberal. But Quigley does say that classical liberalism was essentially the economic theory of the banking elite. That is the perspective that they had at that time, and that's what allowed for the gold standard, which was good for that time. But once the elite concentrate all the control of the gold and they print the gold notes, just going back to a gold standard is not going to do it. If the Queen of England and Lord Rothschild control the gold, then what's the point of a gold standard? I mean, it's not that hard to figure out, right? But in principle, yes, the gold standard was way better than the other stuff. That's what we saw in the Saifedean book that we lectured through. But now we're talking about a global system of a dollar backed gold, a gold backed dollar that then removes itself from gold in 1971. And now it becomes fiat. And now we're in this disaster of money printing, black hole, spiraling debt, which can't be solved. Even uh, Elon, in a recent clip, admitted that if you understand that we can't even pay the interest on this debt, and by the way, who's it to? Well, it's to the people I'm talking about. It's to the international private banking elite. That's where all the debt is owed. It can never be paid back. And what happens is there's a boom bust cycle. And Quigley talks about this boom bust cycle in the FDR chapters, and he says that the purpose of the boom bust cycle, he kind of hints at this, he doesn't explicitly say, but he says basically it seems to be to put the future generations into debt. So you have a boom that happens. There's a bubble. The bubble pops. There's a massive amount of debt that can't be paid. And then the banking elite come in and say, we will bail you out this decade, but you're going to owe us a giant bunch of debt in the next decade. So it's putting the future generations into debt in a seemingly structured boom bust cycle. How controlled it is up for debate, but it seems like they already figured out a long time ago that you could game the boom bust cycle system and not just benefit from it in a monetary way because they print the money. They don't need the fiat dollars. The fiat dollars are a tool to gain actual assets. So laissez-faire liberal economic theory, according to Quigley, was the older strategy of the power elite, the banking elite. That has now caved to what he talks about on pages 550 and 551, the third wave system. Now, again, he was writing this back decades ago, and he was the mentor to Bill Clinton, and Bill Clinton and Tony Blair had a third wave view of combining capitalism with socialism out of the dialectic, perhaps even of the Cold War. What's the dialectical synthesis that we can get out of Eastern communism and Western capitalism? Oh, well, turns out, page 552 and 53, it's large scale state technocracy for every state. China is a perfect example of this, right? And then he ends that chapter by saying, well, what's the key issue that the global technocratic government will have to deal with? Page 554, 55, overpopulation. So again, don't be stupid. I'm not saying Quigley is a good person exposing the conspiracy. No, he's a defender of the system. He's Bill Clinton's mentor. Duh. So when we talk about the liberal world order, he says the liberal world order, neoliberalism is an economic theory. It's neoliberal is economics that is laissez-faire classical. That is classical liberalism. Rejecting the classical Christian worldview of firewalls, nation states, boundaries, and even things like tariffs. Tariffs were an old strategy that even the kings used to do to keep from cheap labor coming in and destroying the people in your kingdom because they could price gouge and do the labor for much cheaper because they were very poor. They would do it for half price. And so the cobbler who charges 2 gold coins, right, would be put out of business because the Asian cobbler who comes in does it for 1 gold coin. That's right. So having immigration control and having tariffs and blocks on these kinds that was to protect the people. Laissez-faire liberal economic theory, which comes out of people like Locke and Ricardo and Adam Smith and all these kinds of characters. And I'm not saying that they're wrong in every point that they had, but Part of the problem was that they are part of the revolutionary ethos, and Quigley explicitly says the French Revolution was funded by Protestant and Jewish banking elites. Why? Why would they fund this? Because they wanted to remove the existing power structure of throne and altar, particularly in this case, France. The French Revolution is funded by Protestant, Swiss, and Jewish banking houses to change the landscape of France. To what? To the French revolutionary, atheistic, secular government, removing God from society. Again, I've had multiple grad classes on French Revolution taught by guys who actually weren't even liberal. I had the one conservative professor I had was teaching French Revolutionary grad and undergrad classes. And so we went really deep into the way deeper than I ever even wanted to go into the history of the French Revolution. And you have a right wing and a left wing of the French Revolutionary provisional government, the Jacobins and the Girondins. The Girondins were also revolutionary. And I'm not saying that they weren't good in some aspects. The founding fathers, very much influenced by the Girondins, a lot of good things, a lot of good principles. But there is still this Freemasonic Enlightenment deistic idea coming out of the Enlightenment, coming out of the scientific revolution, that you can have world governance that's positive and will work through free trade and economic liberalism. And I don't think that makes any sense. So that's my main critique. If you read, for example, Immanuel Kant's Enlightenment essay on free trade and global government, he says, oh, if we just have everybody having free exchange, then we won't have world wars anymore. I mean, it's just so naive, as if world wars are just all about economic theory and not about human avarice and wickedness. So it's a false analysis. It's a false anthropology. It doesn't take into account that, well, human beings don't just act on the basis of economic choices. They also act on the basis of irrational, evil motivations and decisions, right? So Enlightenment economic and anthropological theory is based on man not being fallen. It's based on a Pelagian view of man as a interchangeable economic unit that is a blank slate. Well, guess what? Ever since the last 100 years or so of genetic theory and a lot of prominent famous geneticists, we know now that the Enlightenment theory that man's a tabula rasa is false. You are actually imprinted with characteristics from your parents and from genetic ancestor memories. Well, that means then that you're not a blank slate when you're born. And that means that you don't just imprint on people the external stimuli. They actually have an internal component to them that's already part of them. So the Enlightenment anthropology is just not true. Even the Darwinian people who I disagree with have shown and don't believe this Enlightenment tabula rasa view anymore. Otherwise, I mean, they didn't have genetics back then. That's the point. So if genetics is true, then we know that the Enlightenment tabula rasa view is false. Well, guess what? The Enlightenment tabula rasa view is what underlies all of the Enlightenment theorists about world government and economics. And yes, they believed in world government. Immanuel Kant has an entire essay on world government, the New World Order, which he says will be a utopian, free exchange, free trade world order. Von Hayek, in the appendix to Road to Serfdom, says the exact same thing. He says we'll have world government and an international world policing body to worship free trade, basically. I mean, I'm joking when he says worship, but he says that we'll get world peace. This is just so naive, and it's just so silly to think that, especially after we see all of these demonic Antifa people. I mean, this is the end result of centuries of Enlightenment liberalism. Is just classical liberalism leads you to nihilism because there's nothing to ground it in other than what? Natural law, natural rights, natural ethics. Well, when you look at nature, you see predators and prey. So without the theological basis, it's just power struggles. It's just Nietzschean dominance. It's just predator and prey. If it's just predator and prey, then there's nothing wrong with what the insane Antifa people do. Or there is a God, there is truth, there is a church, there is a right and wrong. And we're not born as enlightenment, tabula rasa, blank slates. We have souls. So you understand that, like, right from the outset, if you believe in the fall and that man fell, that's going to affect the rest of your anthropology. You're not going to have unrealistic expectations about, oh, well, I guess if we can just, like, there was a rapper who, was a white girl on one of his rap videos in Europe, and it was a symbolic a doll, but it was supposed to be looking like a realistic white girl doll, right? Oh, well, did he not read the Federalist Papers? I mean, did we not accurately instruct him in the nuances of Jeffersonian theory, like constitutional law? Like, did he not take enough constitutional law classes, or are some people just savages? Some people are just acting out of demonic, savage, instinctual behavior, and you're probably not going to convince all the world to accept constitutional democratic republics. You're probably not going to get people in Pakistan and Afghanistan to accept total equality of the sexes and women's rights. It's probably not going to happen. It's unrealistic. But the Enlightenment attitude of everybody has the same nature because we're all men, yeah, but we're not all created equal. So even in the founding documents, which is all coming out of John Locke, by the way, men are not created, they're equal before the law, but they're not ontologically and physically equal. So it's not true. Well, where did that come from? It comes from John Locke. Well, where did John Locke get it? Well, he's an Enlightenment philosopher, believing in tabula rasa, blank slate. We're all just these pieces of putty, and we're all molded by external stimuli. That is the Enlightenment perspective. Well, guess what? Genetics has disproven that. So why are we still arguing and promoting theories of anthropology that are like 200 years old, 300 years old, that are outdated and false? We're in a post-genetics world where we know that that's not true. Now, I'm not saying that we need to have eugenics and a eugenics super state regime. I'm not saying any of that. I'm saying what we need is Christianity. We need traditional classical Orthodox Christianity. It's the only thing that has the provisions, the stipulations, the sacraments, the philosophy of church and state, the ethics, the rule of law. All those things come out of Christian tradition. And you're not going to find it in pagan philosophers and mysticism and Zionism and Talmudism and atheism and socialism. And all the isms are not going to give you what we've already had and experienced and built in the last 2,000 years in the West and in Orthodox civilization, Byzantium, etc.